Wallace Stevens is one of the major modernist poets, but he represents a somewhat different strain of modernism than that represented by, say, Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot. Stevens's poetry certainly doesn't look like that of those other writers. It employs a more traditional-looking formal diction and style, and it often seems to be a poetry that's more about ideas than about images or things, a more philosophical poetry. Now, for some critics, Ezra Pound is the major poet of the early 20th century, but others see Stevens as the more significant writer. The critic Harold Bloom, for instance, calls Stevens the best and most representative American poet of our time. In contrast, the critic Marjorie Perloff, who tends to favor Pound, has written an essay called Pound/Stevens, Whose Era? But despite this competition, we can also see a lot of connections between Stevens's concerns and those of other modern writers. He shares other modern writers' attraction to the objective, to the hard facts of reality over sentiment, romance, and belief. So there can be something that seems cold or even inhuman about Stevens's aesthetics, best captured in a poem like The Snowman. But his poems are also a powerful testament to the power and necessity of the imagination, and to a pleasure in language that may be unmatched among modern poets. I'll start with a brief bio of Stevens. He was born in 1879 in Reading, Pennsylvania. He attended Harvard from 1897 to 1900, where he published his first poems in the Harvard Advocate. However, he didn't immediately begin a writing career. In 1904, he began a career as a lawyer, ultimately working for the Hartford Insurance Company. In 1909, he married Elsie Kachel. In 1923, his first book, Harmonium, was published. So he didn't become a professional writer, or in fact never became a professional writer, and did not really publish his major poems until middle age. His daughter Holly was born in 1924. In 1934, he became vice president of the Hartford Insurance Company, a position that he'd enjoy until his retirement. And over the next decade, he published a number of books, including Ideas of Order, Man with a Blue Guitar, Parts of a World, and Transport to Summer. By 1950, Stevens was considered one of the major poets of his time, and in The Auroras of Autumn, his 1950 book, won the National Book Award. His collected poems of 1955 won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and Stevens died in 1955. I want to start by highlighting some of the key themes in Stevens's work. One thing that crops up again and again in Stevens's writing is what we might call the tension between the objective and the subjective, or, to put it another way, the tension between reality and the imagination. Stevens always does seem to insist that the way we see the world, or rather what is out there in the world, is really out there as a kind of objective reality. As he puts it in one poem, the pairs are not seen as the observer wills. Things are the way they are, independent of our existence, or what we think of them, or what we as human beings project onto them. And indeed, this is what leads to the seemingly cold or inhuman sense in some of his poems that the world is simply out there and really is unresponsive to our desires to shape it. At the same time, even though Stevens often suggests in his poems that we should strive to see the world in this objective, neutral, unemotional way, his poems are also a chronicle of what he calls the human rage for order, the desire to make sense of what we see around ourselves. And in this sense, he is the ultimate poet in some ways of the power of the human imagination, the constant desire of the imagination to shape the world, to give meaning to the world, even when the world does not respond to us in the way that we would like. So this constant seeming tension, struggle between the reality of the world versus our desire to impose meaning and order on it is one major theme in Stevens's work. Poetry in Stevens's work becomes the medium through which we give meaning to the world. It becomes what he calls the supreme fiction of our lives. It's something imagined, something invented that yet can give a structure to the entire world. And one thing that we'll see in some of his early poems is that poetry as a supreme fiction takes the place of religious meaning, or traditional understandings of what gives our lives meaning. And the poem Sunday Morning is probably one of the best expressions of this. The term supreme fiction comes from a later poem of Stevens's, Notes Towards a Supreme Fiction, which we won't be reading here, but which is a long poem that's certainly worth taking a look at. Another thing that critics often discuss in Stevens's work is the difference between his early poems and his later poems. His early poems from Harmonium, which are most of the poems that we'll be reading, are often thought of as analogous to some of the Imagist poems of a writer like Ezra Pound. They focus on the objective facts of the world. They often focus on things in the world. At the same time, unlike a writer like Pound, who tends to write in a very minimalist fashion, using as few sort of rich adjectives as possible, Stevens's language often has a kind of very sensuous quality, a sense of taking pleasure in the sounds of words, in the imagery conjured up by words, and we'll see that kind of rich sensuality in many of Stevens's poems. Stevens's later poems become more abstract and more philosophical, and especially in his very late poems, become more attuned to the plain sense of things, a statement of simply things as they are. And the struggle of the imagination to make sense of the world seems to fall away in terms of a much more modest and much more bare statement of reality. Stevens's poem The Snowman, which can be found on page 303, might be seen as an exploration of a concept called the pathetic fallacy, something that's rather well known in literary criticism. The pathetic fallacy was originally coined by the literary critic John Ruskin in the 19th century as a way to describe the attribution of human emotions or sensations to inanimate natural objects. We might see personification or the attributing of human characteristics to something that isn't human as a way of thinking about this. Now, what's interesting about The Snowman is that at some level it's a record of an attempt to avoid the pathetic fallacy, to avoid projecting human emotions onto landscape, onto the wind, onto things like trees or leaves. At the same time, it's a demonstration of how this pathetic fallacy is inevitable, how no matter what we try to do, we as human beings will always project meaning onto nature. And so it's an interesting tension between this desire to avoid this projection and the realization that it is inevitable. So let me just read the poem for you quickly. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener, who listens in the snow, and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. The snowman here, of course, is a very literal figure. We have here, you can imagine the scene being described, which is a snowman standing outside in a kind of bare winter landscape. A snowman, of course, doesn't have any particular emotions. He doesn't have any feelings. He literally has a mind of winter because his head is made of snow. The snowman here is a a metaphor or a way of trying to imagine what it would be like for a mind to be devoid of human response or human emotion. The mind of Winter is a mind that somehow has become cold, that sees the world with a kind of cold eye rather than with one that projects emotion onto the things around it. Now, the first thing that's interesting to notice here is the way in which Stevens sets up the speaking situation of the poem.